Hello and welcome, everyone. Welcome to the final Paleo-Indian webinar for 2023. I'm Tina Panic from the Avon Library. I'm here with the Avon Historical Society and the Avon Senior Center. I just want to remind everyone you want to be able to see and hear from the device that you're logging in on. Both of my co-sponsors will do a lot of the thank yous. And if at any point throughout the presentation you have a question, pop it in the chat or the Q&A. We will get to as many as we can at the end, and I'll happily read them aloud for everyone's benefit. And with that, I'll toss it to Jen.
Okay, thank you, Tina. My name is Jennifer from Avon Senior Center. So Avon Senior Center is really pleased to be partnering with the Avon Free Public Library and the Avon Historical Society. I will say I'm super excited for this Zoom tonight. We had the chance to meet Eric in person, and I'm telling you, it's even greater in person. But we are excited about tonight. So again, thank you for joining us. We appreciate it. We're happy to have this series. The Senior Center is happy to participate, as always, with our library and historical society, and we look forward to many more collaborations. So again, Avon Senior Center says thank you, and we're really excited for Eric tonight, and you are going to love it. So, and now we're going to head on to Terry.
Oh, thanks, Jen. I appreciate that. Good evening, everyone. On behalf of the Avon Historical Society, the Avon Library, and the Senior Center, and the Planning Committee for Unearthing History, I welcome you to the fifth and last webinar in year 3 of educational and informative events, mostly covering the paleo people, animals, and land of 12,500 years ago in this region. For those of you joining us for the first time tonight, we welcome you. For those who've been with us on this journey, welcome back. I have 2 quick announcements before we begin. I'm happy to say that we will have another year of webinars in 2024, as Tina mentioned. A grant request has been submitted again to the Lower Farmington River and Salmon Brook Wild and Scenic Committee of the Farmington River Watershed Association, one of our partners in this endeavor, to help us with the costs. Our other partners are Avon Land Trust and the Institute for American Indian Studies in Washington, Connecticut. We will maintain the same schedule of 5 webinars next year, beginning in March of 2024. The origin of this webinar series is the discovery almost 5 years ago, which we just realized about 10 minutes ago, in 2019, of the Brian D. Jones Paleo-Indian site along the Farmington River here in Avon, Connecticut, where a bridge was being constructed by the Connecticut Department of Transportation. To learn more, please visit the Avon Historical Society's website and drop down the page for the Brian D. Jones site. Tonight, as we have done for the past 2 years in October, we're celebrating Archaeology Month in Connecticut. Last year's October webinar, we met Dr. Eric Heffter, who's project archaeologist at Archaeological and Historical Services in Storrs, Connecticut, which is the company under contract with the Connecticut DOT to provide an update on the analysis. Eric has over 10 years of experience studying the archaeology and geoarchaeology of North America and Central and Southeastern Europe, working in both cultural resource management and academic settings. He holds a BA in anthropology with minors in maritime archaeology and business from the University of Connecticut, and an MA in anthropology from the University of Arizona. He was a Fulbright Scholar to the Republic of Serbia in the Balkans in 2016, where he conducted Paleolithic fieldwork. He graduated with a PhD in anthropology and a minor in geosciences from the University of Arizona in 2021. His dissertation analyzed stone tools to gain a better understanding of human population movements in the Balkans during the Upper Paleolithic period. Early Upper Paleolithic period. His research interests include lithic analysis, applying GIS to archaeological data sets, Paleolithic archaeology, and geoarchaeology. Before joining Archaeological and Historical Services as a project archaeologist in 2021, Dr. Heffter worked as an archaeologist on various projects at the Mashantucket Museum and Research Center and the University of Massachusetts Archaeological Services, and served as a teaching assistant at the University of Arizona. He's involved with all stages of archaeological investigations, report preparation, and GIS analysis. He's going to present tonight a quick research update and review what information they have so far and the importance of this site to the region. He's going to give an overview of the discovery in 2019 as well, to kind of bring us back to where we started 5 years ago. Due to the nature and importance of this presentation, we allotted 90 minutes, so there will be time for Q&A. So thank you, Dr. Heffter, for being with us tonight, and we can't wait to hear what you have to share, and the floor is yours.
All right. Thank you very much, Terry. Wow, yeah. Let's see here. Okay. Assuming everybody can see that.
Yes, we can see it. Just has to pop to the full. There you go. Now it's full screen. Nope, then it went away again.
Oh, I guess there's a bit of a delay. Okay, there we go.
Perfect.
Well, thanks everyone. Quite the introduction there. So yeah, I mean, it's crazy. It's been almost 5 years since the site has been discovered. Time really does fly. So, you know, as Terry sort of described, I'm going to do sort of like a quick overview of the site background, as well as some sort of like updates, and finally just sort of close with why the site's so important. And I think one of the things that sort of happened is that we did so much sort of analysis and research, we're kind of more at the synthesis phase. So there's not quite so much to report on, but that's okay. It'll still be, you know, pretty exciting, I think. So again, you know, just sort of overview of the site. You know, it's on the Farmington River. You can actually see sort of an overview here. And basically, in a nutshell, the site was found during the replacement of a bridge on Old Farms Road in January 2019. It's a Connecticut Department of Transportation project. So that's something important to remember. You know, this is something that, you know, has state of Connecticut funding. So, you know, our tax dollars basically paid for, you know, finding the site and also excavating it to, you know, such very good detail. So, you know, I'd like to just, you know, point out that CONDOT didn't have to go to this level of detail, but they recognize the importance of this site. And so, you know, they were able to fund it appropriately. And of course, it's named for the former state archaeologist of Connecticut, Brian Jones. A little bit further in the discussion, I'll kind of talk about particularly why this site was named after him, aside from him being sort of a tireless researcher, a tireless, you know, educational advocate, someone who was always very interested in paleo-Indians. There's something very specific to the site itself that really makes it relevant that it's named after him. And there are a few pictures of Brian here on the right-hand side. So, you know, just sort of a bit of an overview here, you know, what actually happened over those few months. So I was not really with AHS at this time. I was still finishing up my dissertation at the University of Arizona. In fact, I think during like the end stages of this, I might have been overseas or something like that. So, you know, in terms of like I was there for maybe about a month or so, and I was just sort of excavating, and it was a lot of fun because I mean, you don't come across sites like this. And so Mary Harper, you know, the president of AHS, you know, she was the PI for this, but also too, like other people who were in charge were, you know, Sarah Sportman, Dr. David Leslie. And so actually Dave, who's a friend of mine, he actually calls me up, I think in like February, and he's like, hey, do you want to excavate on a, you know, 10 or 12,000 year old site? And I'm like, okay, yeah, that sounds pretty good. And it was. And so over a period of several months, basically 210 1 by 1 meter excavation units were excavated. So, you know, in the center photo there, you know, you can sort of, you know, see basically that is about 210 square meters there, and meters about 3 feet or so. So a lot of dirt moved. And then in terms of what we got out of the site, we got a large number of cultural materials here in the lower left. So one of the first things we talk about are lithics, you know, the stone tools, arrowheads, whatever you want to call them, botanicals, ecofacts, seeds, nuts, that sort of thing. We have some other artifacts that, you know, are surely paleo-Indian, but don't fall into these other categories. Not really that much faunal stuff, bones, basically. A lot of that is because of the age of the site and because in general, bones do not preserve very well in the acidic soils in Connecticut unless they've been burned. And there were, you know, a handful of historic artifacts. So that also shows how nice and intact this site was. It is definitely, pre-contact Paleo-Indian and so forth. And just talking about our time periods here, right? So, in terms of what we're looking at the very bottom here, Paleo-Indian. I mean, you really don't get any older than that. And it's actually a little interesting for me, right? Because the time period I worked on in my PhD, sort of this like early Upper Paleolithic time period in Europe, that's about like 45,000 years ago. So this to me in some ways is like a little younger than what I'm used to, but it's still, incredibly old. And what's important to note is that, the Paleo-Indians, they're humans, they're us, they're just like us, they are us. So, it's very sort of interesting, I think, to sort of just imagine, us, but, 11 or 13,000 years ago. I mean, it's crazy to think about. And then on the right-hand side here, you have the various types of, what we call, projectile points, arrowheads, you can also call them. And so you can see the different types. There's a very specific sort of types for the Paleo-Indian. You have these sort of fluted points where there's, basically been sort of one removal up the middle. And so just in terms of some of the material that we've recovered from Brian Jones, of course, the, one of the most numerous artifacts are the lithics, the stone tools that I was just talking about. And so I have photographs here of various kinds of stone tools. Stone tools can really be used for anything really that requires any sort of like cutting tasks, sharpening tasks, anything like that. And so, for example, we have, various types of, on the top left here, end scrapers. These might have been used for like sort of scraping hides for animal skins. On the lower left, you have these side scrapers, again, also scraping. You have various other types of tools. One of the other things that's kind of interesting is in the top right here, we have like one of the few sort of typable projectile points. And this is like a Bullbrook, maybe Athens Hill fragment of a projectile point. But that's one of the problems potentially that we could have had at Brian Jones if we didn't have other sources of evidence. So we have, this one sort of projectile point. There's other things that kind of tell us it's Paleo-Indian, but it's not until you get all the radiocarbon dates that I talk about later that it's like, wow, this is like strongly, strongly Paleo-Indian without a doubt. One of the other things too that's nice about Brian Jones is that, aside from, of course, confirming that there is a Paleo-Indian occupation, I think one of the other things that's important is that this is like, a site. This shows people living. It's not just, a stray projectile point or something like that. And so during the excavation, we encountered 40 soil anomalies. That's just sort of a fancy way of saying stains in the soil. If you look on the right-hand side, you can see sort of some of those stains or anomalies. And these anomalies can be caused by many things, right? They can be caused by like rodents burrowing in. It can be caused by tree roots, can be caused by many sort of natural factors, but also too by cultural things. So just imagine you are, let's say, outside and you've built a fire. And, you have like a nice little hearth. You have to then basically, put it out. And, you basically sort of have all this ash and stuff over time. Maybe that gets covered. And in about 10,000 years or so, I can go and excavate it. And I could see that, oh, yeah, somebody made a fire around here. And so we have those sorts of what we call features. That's just a fancy way of saying that these are things unlike, let's say, a projectile point or like maybe a nutshell or something that it's like, I can't really remove it completely from the site. I have to excavate it in a special way. And so we have 31 of these cultural features. And there are various things you can see in the middle of the site plan that shows the features. We have some hearths, we have some, posts. We also have sort of this large cobble feature, which is in sort of the upper right-hand photo there. And, this is kind of an interesting thing because we know based on, some of the geomorphology and geology done from the site that there's no way possible that these large, cobbles could have gotten deposited by the river. And so they were brought in by people. And one idea that we have, and I think is a pretty good idea, is that these are, could be discarded boiling stones. We also found pigment, ochre. So there's a lot more going on here than just, like some lithics found or something like that. Just talking about the botanicals, we recovered a wide array of botanicals from those archaeological features. I was saying before that, faunal stuff, animal bone doesn't really preserve. The exception to that is if it's charred. But one of the other things too is that botanicals as well, seeds, nuts, whatever, if they're not charred, especially for this time period so far back, they don't really preserve. But if you char it, that, or you burn it, then it becomes more preserved. And that's great because, we have these cultural features like the hearth or something like that. And basically because people burn these things, we're now able to recover and analyze them. And so our in-house botanical analyst, Catherine Reinhardt, analyzed all the botanicals from the Brian Jones site. And she discovered a wide variety of edible plants: blueberry, pincherry, cattail, strawberry, goosefoot, acorn, wide variety of botanicals. And then one of the other things that I want to kind of get onto here, and hopefully I won't get into the weeds too much, is sort of this whole thing with radiocarbon. And so, we had one typeable projectile point, and there were other indicators, of course, that this is like a paleo-Indian site. But the thing is that, the paleo-Indian period goes on for thousands of years. When would the site actually be? Without radiocarbon dating, we wouldn't really know. Certainly we would not be able to say that it's the oldest site in, southern New England. And so this is why this radiocarbon thing is so crucial. And so basically the long and short of it is I was just talking about all those burned eco-facts, like, your strawberry, your blueberry seeds, your acorns and stuff like that. People are also burning wood. And so all of these things have, of course, carbon in them. They're organic. And so because that they've now been burned and preserved, what we can do is, we can basically extract them from the site, and we can, actually get like a real date on them. And by real date, I mean like an actual sort of calendar or calibrated date. And, this is just sort of, I got this sort of graphic on the right here, where basically, we all sort of consume carbon, of course. When we're alive, all the different sort of isotopes of carbon are in equilibrium with the environment. However, once we die, right, there's different kinds of carbon. So carbon-14 is the radioactive carbon. And so over time, it decays. And so as you go, as something decays more and more, it loses more of this radioactive carbon. And by seeing how much of this radioactive carbon is left, we can actually figure out how old something is. And, it does give us like an actual calendar date. Now, this stuff is, this methodology has been around for over 50 years. And one of the other things that they found out pretty quickly is that the amount of carbon-14 in the atmosphere changes over time. And so you have to find sort of other ways to adjust the date a little bit. And so without going into too much detail here, I have this sort of figure on the left, where what you have here is you have sort of what's called the radiocarbon date, and then you have this calibrated date. And so basically what happens is, you have just these radiocarbon years, and then you do, through various sort of mechanisms, a conversion process, and that gives you a calibrated date, or what would be a calendar date. And so this particular feature, which is from the Brian Jones site, there's a lot of math around here, but you can say that it's probably about 12,500 years old, Cal BP. So about 12,500 years ago. That's all you need to know from the long and short of it, is that Cal BP, 12,500 years ago, it's about 12,500 years ago. But what's so important here, right, is that, if we had, let's say, one date, that could confirm that it's the oldest site. But we don't just have one date. We don't have two dates. We have 23 radiocarbon dates. And what they show is not only that, it is the oldest site in Connecticut and southern New England, but that we also have, several discrete occupations. So this isn't just like one time when people were, decided to come to this site and camp there and then leave. People are coming back to this site repeatedly over thousands of years. And it's just amazing to actually see that. Usually, you have an idea, of course, that, a site was probably used for multiple periods of time, but you never really, it's quite unusual to see something like this. So that's just another thing that's so remarkable about this. And because of the number of the radiocarbon dates, we can then tie in other analyses, and it gives us sort of like a good sort of, when did these things happen? And that'll kind of, come up a little bit later in the talk. So as I was just saying, before, we have an incredible number of different analyses, right? We have the radiocarbon dating, we have protein residue analysis, lithic use wear. So basically you figure out, what's on the stone tools, various other analyses that are more environmental indicators. Last year I talked about micromorphology. So that just sort of, allows us to analyze sort of how sediments and soils were deposited on the site, basically confirms, that sediment accumulated in a very sort of slow manner. So that allowed, one of the reasons that we have such great preservation of Brian Jones, and a bunch of other analyses. And so, we have a lot of data to play around with. It's really remarkable. And, just kind of an overview in terms of recent news here. So, we've done pretty much most of the analyses that we need. So I don't really have much to report in terms of new analyses. It's basically going to be more about synthesis at this point. But, because we have so many analyses and because they are sort of integrated together, I think that synthesis is going to be even more powerful than, if we just had, an extra analysis or two. So in terms of recent news here, I'd say the biggest thing was that the site got nominated and listed in the State Register of Historic Places. So it's not actually the site itself, it's the area around the site, because when the site was excavated in basically the where the bridge was going to go, 100% of the site within the boundary of the construction area of the bridge was removed. And so if you go back there, there isn't like a Brian Jones site per se, it's all been excavated away. But one of the cool things is that, past with Dr. David Leslie, Will Ouimet, and a few other people, what they did, and this is, I think, pretty clever, is that they used ground penetrating radar, GPR, basically to sort of survey the area around the site. And so they know basically what the underlying geology of the portion of the Brian Jones site that was excavated looks like. They did, GPR survey there before, and they also did some coring. So they were able to then confirm what they saw in the GPR signature with actually pulling out sediment from the ground. And so what they then did is they're like, okay, so Brian Jones is on this kind of landform. Let's see how far it goes. And with the GPR and with the coring, they were able to actually define the extent of the landform. And so while the site itself, the site that I'm talking about, is no longer there, they determined that the landform continues on. And it's incredibly likely, if not certain, because there was also a bit of charcoal found in one of the cores, that the site does continue across more of the landform. And so it's actually really great that it's now listed in the State Register of Historic Places, because now it'll be protected. And, perhaps in the future, decades from now, other archaeologists might be interested in excavating other portions of the Brian Jones site. And I think also too, it's, good in terms of honoring the memory of Brian Jones, and also as just a way of showing how important this site is. And I don't want to get too into the weeds here, but of course, like everything else, this is sort of government related, right? So there's a very strict set of criteria in terms of what makes something, eligible for listing on the State Register of Historic Places. And so this is a lot of text, but it can be associated with events that have made significant contribution to our history and the lives of persons significant in our past, which is just a fancy way of saying that, this site or whatever, something important happened here. Like, maybe, an important person, lived here, something important sort of happened. Embody the distinctive characteristics of a type, period, or method of construction. This is more for historic stuff, right? If you have like a really nice house that represents a, particular type of architecture from a time period. Another criteria is represent the work of a master, possess high artistic values, or represent significant or distinguishable entity whose components may lack individual distinction. Oh boy, that's a tongue twister, isn't it? But basically that one is kind of like, something that's really artistic, maybe a notable artist made it, something like that. And then the last sort of category is, a site or building that has yielded or may be likely to yield information important in prehistory or history. And so without going into the weeds here, obviously it looks like 2 and 3 our site doesn't qualify for. But it definitely qualifies for the first one because, this is the oldest dated, evidence of human occupation in Connecticut and southern New England, right? I'd say that's pretty important. And then the fourth one there is, basically what we call like information potential. And so, a site can maybe not have any of these first 3 things. But if you say to me like, oh, hey, like I can't really put this site with like a significant like event or a significant person, but, there's so much information on this site that's important to the scientific community. This is why this is something that should be listed. That's what number 4 is. And obviously, just based on what I was just talking about with the number of analyses that we've done at Brian Jones, Brian Jones is absolutely, eligible based on criteria for there. We've learned so much about history from this site. It really, I can't sum it up in the amount of time that I have here, but, it really kind of has upended a lot of our ideas, in terms of, paleo-Indians in southern New England, and also in terms of how likely it is that we can find other paleo-Indian sites. So, just kind of going on here in terms of like, why is the site important, right? So I'm going to touch on 3 things because again, right, there could be so many things I could talk about here. The site location, the preservation. The second would be, of course, the age, the suite of the radiocarbon dates, and focusing on the sort of mastodon protein residue. So giving you kind of a little bit of expanded history on the site area itself. And so the Paleo-Indian site, the one that I'm talking about here, that was, found in 2018, 2019, around there. However, like this area here was originally first excavated in the 80s and the 90s. And so there was actually a woodland period site. This is thousands of years later that was, uncovered basically kind of on top of it. And, so the question might be, well, how do you find this Paleo-Indian site, right? You just said that this area had been surveyed by trained archaeologists. Well, it's not an issue with the archaeologists or anything like that. So AHS, in connection with the project to basically build this new bridge, they surveyed the area in 2014. There's no evidence of the woodland sites that are talked about in previous archaeological reports, but deeply buried alluvium, basically, like river sediment, was noted at the bottom of, sort of test pits. And so this indicated that there might be earlier occupations because the way that soil kind of works here in Connecticut, right? You kind of have what's been plowed, you have something kind of underneath it that's sort of a bit transitional. And then you have a type of soil that, was deposited here by glaciers. It's one of those things where once you see it, what you're looking at. It's like pretty cobbly. There's various sort of types of like coarse sands, gravels, stuff like that in there. But at this site, there's not really any of that. Instead, you get this fine alluvium, right? This very fine, sand, very, silty sort of sediment. And basically, if you sort of find that at the bottom of sort of your test pit where you would be expecting to find glacial sediment, you're like, well, we haven't found anything, but we also haven't reached the point where you could be comfortable in saying that there isn't any archaeological, occupations perhaps, because, the glacial stuff, nobody is living here at that time. But this deeply buried alluvium, there could be earlier occupations in there. Like, this is not unheard of. Other parts of the country, many famous archaeological sites are buried in basically, river deposits. And you have basically right next to you have this site basically right next to the Farmington River. And so then the issue becomes, well, how do you get down to it? This is the sort of fundamental problem. This is one of the reasons why it wasn't sort of discovered in the 80s and 90s. And that's because the way that we do archaeological survey, in so many words, is that we basically, dig holes in the ground. But in this particular case, the type of holes that we dig are what are called shovel test pits. And so these are basically square holes in the ground that are about 1.5 feet wide by 1.5 feet wide, give or take. They go down about 3 feet or so, because that's about as deep as you can get with a shovel, with basically a hole that size. And so you can't really go any deeper. And so what this means is that if you're hitting sort of this deeply buried alluvium at 3 feet, well, with sort of basic sort of survey technology, the standard of the industry, you really can't go any deeper. And so Dr. Jones recognized this. And he's like, well, hey, hold on a second, it's a bit rough here, right? Because we haven't really found much of anything, but, we do have this deeply buried alluvium. There could be earlier occupations here. And so in order to discount that fact, let's try to remove, some of those top layers of sediment so we can actually reach, maybe some unknown archaeological sites. And so that's basically what happened, topsoil was removed. And then once, we were kind of closer to sort of these, where we would expect to see sort of paleo-indian, components and stuff like that, the survey encountered them. And so at that point, there was, a massive sort of data recovery just to get, this very important site here. But only by digging, deeper did we know it was there. And this was something that, Dr. Jones had talked about, for, I think, many decades that, he was doing archaeology. And so, it was nice to sort of see that this panned out. And so, what do you kind of have here, right? You have sort of, you can prove now that there are these deeply buried paleo-indian sites in Connecticut. Now, there's another paleo-indian site in Templeton that's also, buried by alluvium. But, this shows that Templeton is not necessarily a rarity, that there are probably other deeply buried paleo-indian sites throughout the state. We just haven't found them yet. But also, too, in the process of excavating this site, we've basically been given the tools, to basically try to find other paleo-indian sites. And so I think this combination of the GPR and the vibrocoring, the coring together, that, can at least show us the extent of basically, landforms that would have paleo-indian sites on them. It also shows, too, that a lot of times when people think about like the rivers or something like that, they think like, oh man, rivers are just like, they move really fast. How can anything ever preserve there? It doesn't seem like even if you had sediment or layers that date to the paleo-indian times, that you would have anything left. Well, Templeton, but more specifically here, Brian Jones shows that's not the case. In fact, the way that the geology and the geomorphology worked at this site is it actually protected the site. And so after abandonment, sediment slowly, basically covered the archaeology that was there. And so, what we have is just really, really nice preservation. And I think what this also kind of shows is that, I think if you were to tell somebody like we didn't find anything, but, if you remove all of this topsoil or whatever, they might be a little suspicious. But this site here, it shows like, hey, it's not always going to be a slam dunk, but it is possible to actually find a paleo-indian site. You can excavate it in sort of like an industry, Department of Transportation, cultural resource management context, and you can get amazing results. And I think that's something that, is super important, because it's not just, showing that, we could find the site, but also too, that it is possible, to excavate the site, even in the face of real world constraints such as, time, money, whatever. And I think most importantly, of course, is that, it informs us where we could look to see if we could find other paleo-Indian sites in the future. And so one of the other things that I was just kind of talking about is sort of, the importance of all these radiocarbon dates. And so, over here on the left, we have all the cultural features that I was talking about earlier. On the right, you have sort of these radiocarbon results. I imagine that there's a lot of squiggly lines here, probably not the easiest thing to read, but I think the long and the short of it here is that what you can see a few things on the figure on the right here, and that's you have sort of radiocarbon dates, and some of them, let's say, even with sort of all of the wide squiggly lines or whatever, some of them are on the sort of left-hand side and some are on the right-hand side. And the long and short of that is that this shows that there are multiple occupations at Brian Jones. Without the radiocarbon dates, there'd be other ways that we might be able to talk about that, we have people coming and leaving several times based on what we excavated. If there was, if people were living in a location and then later, the river covered up that occupation, and then, more people moved in and they left sort of archaeological evidence, then of course we'd be able to say that there are multiple occupations. But with the radiocarbon dating, we can show that, we don't necessarily have to have these, separated layers. And so what this shows is that, these cultural features, right? We have, a large number of them. And crucially, they date two different occupations, and several occupations, in fact. And so, I think that's something that's, really important here. And also, too, because of the number of radiocarbon dates, with any sort of analysis like this, right, there's always uncertainty, like, okay, is this date actually real or not? And, you try to pick the best sample you can. So, for example, one of the reasons why we like these cultural features so much as archaeologists is that the stuff that we pull out of them, there's a pretty good chance that, like, that's in its original context, right? It's not like, it got moved there or something like that. Whereas if I found something, let's say, in the soil around it, I could get maybe a date off of like a piece of charcoal or something, but I can't really associate it with much. I can just say that I found it at this depth. I didn't find it in, any sort of like, thing made by humans, but, it's at sort of a similar level of, occupations other humans had. Whereas with these cultural features, it's like, yeah, I know they're human. I can tell sort of what function they had, usually like if it's a hearth or something like that. And what I can do then is, pull out a piece of charcoal or something. And so what we have here is we just have like a large number of dates. And I think one of the other things that's crucial about this is that it also kind of piggybacks onto the other types of analyses, right? So, that kind of leads on to the last thing here, sort of this protein residue analyses. Now, of course, the mastodon, the mammoth is the most important thing, but, that wasn't the only thing that we found. So 19 stone tools were sampled, 9 returned positive results. The research was conducted by Linda Scott Cummings and Travis W. Jones at Paleo Research Institute. And so what did they find on here? What sort of, residue? There are these various sort of families. The thing is that this kind of analysis, it can only give you like a major sort of family. Like it can't say like, this protein residue is associated with like a mouse or a beaver or something. What it can say though is that, there were results from, the same family that has mice and beavers in it. Same with cervidae, deer, right? Something from the Felidae family, probably a mountain lion. There's also Salmonidae family, so trout and salmon, which in itself is pretty interesting. There's also Leporidae, so from the rabbit family. Protein residue that was recovered also came from plants, so from agave and like lily family. But probably, the coolest results, right, is we did get a signature from the Elephas family. And well, I mean, I don't think you need to know Latin to know what that is, right? So, obviously there are no elephants around, right? But, there are mammoths or mastodons. And so one of the things, of course, is, what is it? Like, as I was saying before, this can only tell us sort of a general family, right? So it can't tell us necessarily if it's a mammoth or a mastodon. But what's even the difference between the two, right? So the mammoth is, taller. It has curved tusks, and it's what's called a grazer, right? So you'd associate more with like kind of grasslands and stuff like that. Mastodon, these are shorter and stockier. They have straighter tusks, and they're what are called woody browsers. So you'd expect them more in like more forested habitats. And to really drive the point home, right? Here is somebody holding two different teeth from a mammoth and a mastodon. Right here, the one on the right, that is a mammoth. You can see that it's like really flat. It's like really made for grazing. These are the kind of like teeth that you would find on like maybe, an ungulate or something like that. It's really meant for sort of grinding grasses and stuff. On the other hand, that mastodon one there, yeah, that definitely is more for sort of woody stuff. And if you look at sort of the paleoclimate data at this time in, southern New England, it's mastodon. It's boreal forests, among other things. It's much more wooded, not really that much grassland. So, we're talking about mastodons here. And what's also interesting too, right, is that just right down the road, there was a mastodon skeleton that was found in Farmington in the base of a peat bog in 1913, the Farmington Pope mastodon. And, while this was excavated a long time ago, they didn't find any sort of evidence of like stone tools or something to, indicate that humans were there. I suppose it's possible that they missed it, but it sounds like based on sort of site reports and journals and stuff like that, they were pretty meticulous. So basically, up until Brian Jones, right, we don't really have, we have mastodons, but we don't have any sort of evidence of people and mastodons, overlapping time-wise. And so, for example, this Pope mastodon here, right, Bullinger and Jones, Brian Jones, right, in 2015, they got a new radiocarbon date from this Pope mastodon nearby. And so, it dates to, about 14,200 to 14,900 thousand years ago. And so the oldest dates we have at Brian Jones, give or take, about 12,500. So this mastodon is about, let's say about 2,000 years older than anything that we have at Brian Jones. Now, could this be an indicator that maybe there were not people here at 14,500 years ago, and that's why you don't see them at the Pope mastodon? Definitely a possibility. But I think what's more important here is that you do have, mastodons that are present nearby earlier, but there's certainly no reason why they wouldn't have been around for the dates that we get at Brian Jones. It's only separated by about 12,500 years. And, that's just, that's really amazing because now we have direct evidence for this overlap between mastodon and humans. And then it kind of, allows us to ask questions about how were people using these mastodons? What were they using it for? How were they getting them? Mastodons are pretty big and they have like a lot of meat, is it something that, were they hunted? Were they scavenged? Were people, if people were scavenging them, were they, collecting meat off them, or were they scavenging them for, their tusks or their bones or something like that, or their hides? It just, it opens up a lot of sort of new avenues of sort of thinking about paleo-Indian lifeways, with this direct evidence. And then, so just to kind of summarize here, right? So in terms of sort of updates, the site was added to the State Register of Historic Places, which, is very important. It helps protect the site. And again, why is the site important, right? We talked about the site location. We talk about it in terms of, this might be, we might be able to find other deeply buried Paleo-Indian sites. This is not necessarily a rarity. Also, too, the number and the suite of radiocarbon dates is super important. I think one of the things I kind of forgot to mention is that before the dating of the Brian Jones site, I think we had 23 radiocarbon dates. Before that, there were only 28 Paleo-Indian radiocarbon dates in the Northeast, right? So we've almost doubled the number of radiocarbon or Paleo-Indian age radiocarbon dates, and that's just from this one site. I mean, that's really important. The mastodon protein residue, shows some direct evidence of, humans and mastodons together. I mean, that's a new result. That's a pretty interesting result. And so, I may talk about how these results are like cool or interesting, but it's not just about them being cool for the sake that they're cool. Although, of course, finding, a stone tool that maybe has some mastodon residue on it, that is pretty cool, right? But, these are things that directly impact, what we know about Paleo-Indian lifeways and basically guides future research and excavation. So going back to that terrible slide that I had of those 4 criteria for the State Register of Historic Places, and one of them was the information potential. What can this site is important because it adds something to, our understanding of the past, of prehistory. And I mean, the Brian Jones site absolutely does that. And, I think it's just one of those things where it's difficult enough to find these sorts of sites. So to be able to find this site, then to actually have, the money available, the funding available to actually excavate it in a proper way, to actually do all of these analyses, is really quite special and unique. I mean, it really is remarkable. And it's one of those things where we'll be talking about this site and publishing about it and, analyzing it for years to come. So, hopefully next year we can do a bit of a better sort of synthesis to wrap this up. But just even with this information that we have, it's, again, a really remarkable site. So that's all I have.
All right. Thank you, Eric. Well, we give everyone a moment to type any questions they have in the chat or the Q&A. I just thought I'd ask you, what is your favorite aspect of the site? Or do you have a favorite aspect? I don't want to assume.
Boy, I mean, it's really tough, right? I would say that for me, I think it's just, boy, it's really tough to say. I think at the end of the day, what it is for me is just, the sequencing and sort of the relationship between all of these analyses, which, oh, sorry, I just saw a question there. As I was saying before, they combine together, right? And so, if we had that mastodon evidence without the radiocarbon dating, people might be a bit more suspicious of it. And also, too, it's like, well, what does that actually mean? But, now that we know kind of the oldest date for Brian Jones, it's like, it seems like actually a pretty reasonable interpretation. So just that sort of stuff. And I didn't really go into it, but because we were able to radiocarbon date, a lot of these cultural features, that also gives us an age of sort of botanicals and stuff that we find within the hearths. And, so that gives us like kind of, another avenue of analyzing paleo-environmental data. It's not perfect by any means because, people choose, things to eat and things to wood for fire that, doesn't necessarily reflect like what you see out in nature, but it still, you know, provides at least a different indicator of like what was available for people to use.
Okay, thank you. So this question, Terry, you might want to answer first. It is the Brian Jones site open to tours, which is definitely a question we've received before at the library, and I know you've received at the Historical Society.
Right. No, the site is gone. I have to say, it is covered. Now, this was a Connecticut Department of Transportation project. So according to guidelines by the federal and state governments, when federal funding is used for a project like this, there has to be a surface analysis done. This is done all over the place. And this is how a lot of archaeological finds really do happen because of this kind of a rule. In this case, when Brian Jones asked to go deeper and this site was initially found, all the work stopped. It went to the other side of the river for continuation to allow time for Archaeological and Historical Services and the DOT to find this deeply buried site and to do all the excavations. So what Eric has showed you on those slides, and Eric, you can chime in if you want to, but those pictures of the different features and the cobbles and all the pieces that came out of there, all of that was taken out for analysis. All the GPR that needed to be done, all the LiDAR that needed, everything that needed to be done for that site was done. And then it was backfilled. And that is where the piers of the new bridge is at now. So there's no way to see the site because it's 6 feet down. However, as I have said to people, if you go to the river, to the Farmington River in Avon, and you go to this, where this site is, and it will eventually be marked with a kiosk that the DOT will be putting up in the next year or two. So there will be an area saying, here is where it was. But if you go down there now and you see this brand new, beautiful bridge, and you're standing on the west side of the river, if you put your back next to the pier underneath the bridge, below your feet, 6 feet down, more or less, is where the site was in an expanded area. But anyway, you're standing over it but you can't get to it. There's nothing to see. However, when the kiosk goes up, there will be information on that. As well, the Avon Historical Society is going to be opening a new museum in the center of town here in one of our old schoolhouses. Next year, we're dedicating one section to it, to this story. And the Institute of American Indian Studies in Washington, Connecticut, where the Templeton site is going to be curating that section for us to explain this. So there'll be all the information that we've been talking about over the last 3 years through these webinars will be available there. And then the Avon Library is considering having a permanent something exhibit as well, whether it's a panel board or a storyboard or something. So there'll be at least 3 sites in Avon to go to read about this, plus the fact that we have produced 8 banners now, 7-foot tall banners with specific aspects of the Paleo period that are now traveling around in Avon in public sites like the town offices, some bank lobbies, some restaurant lobbies, where the general public would see this and just have a quick snapshot of something to do about the period. With a QR code, they could go right in and they could go right to the videos. That's what I wanted to say now. Next was that, and Tina, maybe while I'm doing this, you could put this into the chat. The Avon Library has recorded all of these webinars for the past 3 years. So as of tonight now, we have 15 webinars based on this site and aspects of life and times of the Paleo-Indian. You can go to the Avon Library's website and you can watch all of these videos. And trust me, a lot of things that Eric talked about tonight is well covered. The Mastodon story is covered. The Pope Mastodon story is covered. The river is covered. The geology is covered. There's quite a lot of wonderful experts we've had up and down the East Coast and as far west as than Colorado who have shared information on this time period, the early peopling of this continent. What's coming next year that I can tell you that he did mention tonight is botanicals. His colleague at AHS is going to be giving a talk on the botanicals found at the BDJ site and what that all means. So Tina will finally be able to find out what the strawberries were all about, because she's been fascinated with that. Whereas the rest of us, some of us have been more fascinated with the giant beavers. And now that I found out that you also had mountain lions, which I didn't know there was a mountain lion there. I think I missed that early on, but we're still learning. And like Eric said, this is going to be coming down the road. So I have a quick question for Eric. You studied in Serbia and you said that you were looking at sites that were 40,000 years ago. What period is that compared to the Paleo period? What is that called? Where does that fall in the grand scheme of the human origins of the world?
Okay, well, yeah, I mean, you know, at least in that part of Europe, you know, you have these different time periods. Paleolithic just means Stone Age, right? So, you know, basically the time period I was looking at, let's say 40 to 45,000 years ago, at least in that part of Europe, you have modern humans, us, moving in, you know, probably from the Middle East and Africa, and interbreeding with and displacing Neanderthals who, you know, are related to us. You know, genetic evidence shows that we were able to interbreed successfully. But, you know, you do have a bit of basically have a population turnover. And so that is what that sort of time period shows, at least in that part of Europe. You know, in the whole scheme of things, right, you know, the Americas, you know, are sort of some of the last areas to be colonized by, you know, people. Again, these are modern humans in terms of when did people first get here? Well, you know, there's so many ideas about when that could be. For example, I think in, what was it, Science, even a week ago, I think in White Sands, New Mexico, they have
the footprints.
You know, they have footprints, which, you know, it's not so the footprints are obviously human. But what they're able to do is, you know, they were actually able to date some of the like microfossils inside them, the very small pieces of charcoal and stuff like that, to get a date of when those footprints could have been created. And so that's like, you know, over 20,000 years ago. So much older than Brian Jones. And also too, in terms of peopling of the Americas and stuff like that, you know, the Northeast is kind of one of the later areas, let's say.
Yep.
Okay.
So, I mean, the kind of research that I did, it's still like part of the human story, let's say. But, you know, in many ways, it's kind of similar. We're dealing with people who are nomadic, they're hunter-gatherers, you know, they're moving from place to place. You know, they're making stone tools, no agriculture, you know, so pretty similar in that regard. But again, they're Homo sapiens, they're us, you know, they have language, they have art, they have ornamentation, all of that good stuff.
Yeah, that's cool.
The next audience question sort of piggybacks on this, so I'll do the audience questions out of order just because it seems to go with what you're talking about. What was it about the site on the Farmington River that made people keep on settling there after all those different times? And is there evidence that the same lineage of people kept coming back the way migratory birds, migrating birds, or was it entirely new people every time, or is there really no way to know?
Ooh, good question. I mean, I think that, you know, there's a few sort of different things in terms of, you know, people will settle in an area because it's like favorable or whatever, right? But also too, you know, after 10, 12,000 years or whatever, a lot of places where people lived have, you know, been destroyed by the environment. You can think about floods. You can think about like all sorts of things that, you know, would destroy an archaeological site. So that way it would leave no trace of it. And so I think that, you know, based on geomorphological data that, you know, AHS collected, you know, this area does seem to be sort of protected by like an older levee. So, you know, it's possible that that would have sort of protected, you know, that would have protected the site from flooding. So instead you kind of have these sort of more gradual flooding episodes. And so that could have been a preferred, or one of the reasons why people settled here. You know, it is right next to the river, of course, you know, and with some of the protein residue analysis showing that, you know, there is, you know, harvesting of, you know, fish from the trout and salmon family, that, you know, this could have been a place perhaps where, you know, during certain times of the year, there were a lot of trout and salmon. And so maybe people took advantage of that. Again, total possibility there. But also too, in many ways, that certain aspects of the landscape that made people come there were probably also what allowed the landscape to preserve, you know? And so that's why we're able to see it and excavate it all these thousands of years later. Sorry, the second half was, is it the same group of people or different groups?
Right,
like
correct.
That, right?
Yes.
Ooh, that's a tough one. You know, I know that I believe there's been a talk with, you know, a paleogeneticist, She might have a better idea of sort of that sort of thing. I think it would be difficult to say. And then, you know, you have to remember, right? There's many different sort of ways where you could like say same people or whatever, right? You know, are they genetically the same? Are they the same because they use the same stone tools as their ancestors, right? So, I mean, I think that's kind of a difficult question to answer. And of course, there's also oral tradition as well, right? So I think at the end of the day, I'm going to kind of punt on that one.
That's fine. And then this question, I think, brings everything full circle. Was there an expectation of discovery at the site? And if not, can you tell us a little more about who recognized the importance of it? And this would be at the beginning when you were first excavating.
Yeah. So, I mean, you know, again, just sort of based on what I was talking about, right? You know, this particular phase of excavation began in like, you know, or the original survey began in 2014. I wasn't here at all, right? So, you know, forgive me if I don't quite have the history right, but my understanding is basically that, you know, previous, you know, people who had surveyed the area had recognized that, you know, that they hadn't reached sort of glacial sediments, but it's sort of like, what do you do about that, right? And, you know, when AHS and Brian sort of surveyed the area, they're like, well, you know, it looks like there are deeply buried like alluvial sediments here. And, you know, there's, you know, a good, you know, basically in terms of, let's say, due diligence, you know, like let's remove, you know, some of the sediment from the surface. So that way as archaeologists, we can get in there, we can do the kind of testing that we normally do, and we would be able to figure out very quickly whether or not there is actually, you know, any evidence of occupation in these, you know, river sediment layers. And so there's the expectation in the sense that people like to live next to rivers. You know, the preservation, you know, potentially could be good, that we found sites in, you know, we found deeply buried sites that are paleo-indian like this before. And then just again, in the context of like more of a regulatory due diligence sort of thing, you know, making sure that, you know, no work would be impacted. And it's one of those things, right, where, you know, if there is like, let's say an archaeological site or something, you know, if there is an archaeological site or something discovered, you know, in sort of a project area or whatever, you know, the first thing you want to do is like try to avoid it. Maybe, you know, like the project or whatever can be built around it or something like that. Or usually there's several different alternatives that a construction project will have. Like you can think about it in terms of a road or something like that. Obviously for here, you know, kind of hard to, you know, move a bridge, right? So, you know, basically, you know, you had like this really nice constrained footprint area, right? And so, you know, like, okay, this is as far as it's going to go. We can test there. You know, once this topsoil gets removed, it should be pretty straightforward. So, I mean, I would say that it was, you know, it had potential in that sense.
Okay, very good. And then we have another question just in terms of other similar sites within New England and along the rivers. And there are other webinars on our YouTube channel where we talk about New England, the Champlain Valley, things like that. So I'll send the link out to everything for our YouTube site and all the recordings to everyone tomorrow. So that brings us to any final thoughts from the two of you before we wrap up, Eric or Terry?
I would, let me just, Eric, I'll let you have the last word, but I just want to just thank everybody for having been with us. If you have been for 3 years, there is a year 4 coming, and next year is going to be kind of an interesting year because it's also going to end 2024 with something exciting at the Avon Library on human origins that Tina will talk about next year. But we're going to be continuing and diving farther back into history that way. So we have a lot coming in 2024, and I hope that you all will stick with us and tell others about this. Please visit the site, please visit the website for the other videos that we have, because a lot of these experts who have spoken have really shared with us an awful lot about this time period that I'm sure most didn't really know. And Eric, I don't know if I'm wrong in saying this, because somebody asked about this, asked about going back in time for this to know if it was the type of people who were here. I don't think the tribes anybody would know the tribes who were here, but this site, from what we have learned, was a perfect site, not only because of the levee and it allowed the water to just gently flow over and bury the site, but also this part of the Farmington River, if you're not familiar, flows north. And to push water north, as our geologist told us a couple of years ago in one of the webinars, is very hard, and it makes the water very slow, very calm. So it's easy for fishing, easy for transportation, easy for using the water. And from what I understand, because of on the other side of the river, across from this site, the Brian Jones site, across the river, of course, is our what we call our Avon Mountain. And so I believe, from what archaeologists have told us, when you are looking at the river from that point, you're looking at exactly what they looked at 12,000 years ago. The river has not changed much in that long time period. So you're really seeing what they saw. You're seeing the width of it, the depth of it. They were farther down, deeper, but that doesn't mean that they were not flooded by it, except at certain times of the year. They probably were, because of weather changes. And I think one of the archaeologists also told us in one of the webinars that there's been probably, since that time period, a good half a dozen major climate changes over this time period. So the one we're going through now is not unique. It has happened before. It's just that we've sped it up. I think the humans have sped it up, according to the scientists. But anyway, I will stop talking and let Eric speak. I thank you very much, Tina, and thank you, everybody. We will see you next year. Eric, you have the final word.
Okay, yeah. I really don't have much else to say. It just, again, this is an amazing site. It's crazy to think that this was excavated in 2019. Yeah, and I think one of the things that it really has done is, the YouTube series and everything like that, that really does provide a much more detailed overview than I could ever provide in terms of, many specific aspects of Brian Jones. And so the YouTube videos that the Avon Historic Society and Avon, Free Library have put up, those are definitely valuable tools for learning more about this time period and also sites in the region. So I really don't have anything else. Thanks everyone for, your time.
Yeah. All right. Thank you, everyone. We'll see you again soon. Bye.
Bye.